Here's a question for you. What does success look like? Not for you personally, although, as we hear later, maybe that could be a part of it. But for the countries of the world, it's economic growth. That's how we rank the nations of the world, as rich or poor, fast-growing or behind the curve. And it's the mantra of mainstream economics, that growth is good. But climate change is causing some economists and policymakers to think again, to argue that economic growth is not the route to the good life, and cuts to consumption, at least in rich countries, are needed. So on this episode of Reuters Econ World, we're going to take a look at those arguments. It's what we do here on the show. Every week, we pick a phrase or buzzword and go deep on the economic principles and ideas driving the biggest news around the world. So this week, the economy and the planet. I'm your host, Carmel Crimmins in Dublin. So we know that producing stuff, which is a big part of economic activity, can be bad for the environment. To produce things, you have to dig up natural resources and belch back polluting waste. To reduce that hit to the planet, countries are cutting their reliance on fossil fuels. And in recent decades, the world's economy has grown faster than the carbon emissions it generates. But that partial decoupling has not been enough to halt or reverse emissions, meaning that the planet is still getting warmer. In 2022, the UN Climate Agency called for cuts in consumer demand to reduce carbon emissions. That's the kind of call normally associated with degrowth theory. Degrowth means shrinking rather than growing economies to use less of the world's resources. The theory can be traced back to 1972, when the French social philosopher André Gorz asked whether production should be scaled back for environmental balance. He used the French term décroissance. To talk to us about economic growth and climate change, I'm joined today by Tim Jackson. He's a British ecological economist who's written about what he calls post-growth economics. Welcome, Tim. Thanks for joining the show.
Yeah, it's a pleasure.
So you're calling for a new ecological macroeconomics. What's wrong with the old macroeconomics?
Well, I guess the main thing is it's a little bit obsessed with the idea of economic growth, the idea of expanding the economy forever. And, it would be all right if we weren't living on a finite planet. But the planet doesn't seem to get any bigger, and we're not any closer to Mars yet. So the idea that the economy goes on getting bigger is a little bit problematic, because it sort of uses up more resources, it creates more waste, it throws it into the environment. We've got plastic everywhere, we've got rivers polluted, we've got air that we can't breathe. We're sort of obsessed with the idea that the right thing to do is to go on growing the economy. And this is the thing about macroeconomics. Who wants to know about macroeconomics, for goodness sake? The thing about it is it developed back in the 1930s, and it was all about keeping growth going. And the whole economy organized itself around that idea that the right thing to do is to pursue economic growth. Not just, when people haven't got enough, but forever.
And across all sorts of different political spectrums, right? Like capitalism, but also communism, right? Both were geared towards.
Communism was just as obsessed with economic growth as capitalism is.
Yeah.
And actually did just as much damage as capitalism has done, at least in the old days, and possibly still now if you count China as being communist. But it isn't about the political spectrum, really. It's about the macroeconomics. It's about the dominant theories about how we make the economy work.
I suppose the rejoinder to that would be that economic growth has pulled a lot of people out of poverty.
Yeah, I think it's really important to acknowledge that, actually. It did its job. I mean, the interesting thing about growth is it kind of works.
Yeah.
I like to think about this in terms of a comparison between sort of economics and health. So, what is health about? Health is about finding the right balance between having too little and having too much. So it's sort of all about that balancing act. Whereas macroeconomics, as we know it, is all about growth. It's about having more, having more, having more, having more. And the trouble with that is that when you've got too little, it's the right thing to do. But you're so busy rushing towards more and more and more that you miss the point at which enough happens. And then you're past that point of enough. And even if you do manage to notice that you've passed that point of enough, you can't turn it around because you're still obsessed with more. And I think that's kind of what's happened. I mean, if you think about food, for example, food is a sort of classic example. We used to live in a world in which a lot of people didn't have enough food and they died from not having enough food. And unfortunately, we still live in a world in which some people don't have enough food and some people still die from not having enough food. But the World Health Organization now agrees that more people die from diseases of overnutrition, of having too much, of having the wrong kind of food and too much of it.
Yeah.
And that's a problem of growth. It's a very specific problem of growth. We've rushed past the decent diet that keeps us healthy into a place where we are overweight, obese, and suffering from chronic disease. And it's a failing of our vision of what the economy is. Rather than setting it up around health and balance, we've set it up around the idea of having more and more.
So tell us, Tim, what is post-growth economics? How does it work?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is, a lot of people say, well, this post-growth thing is just a luxury for the developed countries, for advanced economies, for people who are already rich enough.
Yeah.
And I see it slightly differently. I see it as a responsibility of those countries because they've done an awful lot of growth and they've created an awful lot of environmental damage. And there are still very poor people in poorer countries who cannot feed or clothe or house themselves properly. So there's definitely need for some growth in those poorer places. But in our richer economies, isn't it maybe time to sort of not just keep on growing, but grow up, as it were, and think about what comes next? So the first thing to do, establish the limits because they matter. The environmental limits in particular matter. So make sure you know what they are. Make sure that you're living within them. Make sure that your economy is not trashing the planet the whole time. Make sure that your economic activity is within the boundaries, the safe operating space of the planet. And then the second strand of that was look at the economy. If you've got an economics that is built for its stability around the idea of continual growth, then you're just going to go on and every political party is just going to go on growing and you're going to trash the planet without even realizing it and undermine other people's well-being without even realizing it and destroy our own health without even realizing it because you're just focused on growth. Take your eyes off that and put your eyes on the prize. The prize is human well-being. The prize is how healthy we are. The prize is how the quality of our life meets our aspirations. And then there's a kind of third strand, which is really all about our social aspirations and the social logic that underpins them. Because we live in a social logic that's been built around consumerism. And consumerism is good in the sense that it delivers economic growth, but it's not particularly good in the sense that it undermines the sense and purpose of our lives, our relationships. It's not particularly good when we cast everything that we do and all our social relationships in terms of material stuff. And that's what consumerism tries to do it. So that social logic actually has to start at a cultural level, but it has to be supported by government and by institutions. And it has to create the context for a different kind of world. All three of those tasks are massively important. Establish the limits, fix the economics, change the social logic.
COVID did offer us an opportunity, I suppose, to see what the world would be like if economic activity did slow down dramatically. And it did. I think there was like a 3% plus drop in GDP. But there was only a temporary drop in emissions. Like we all, certainly from the West, we all seem to hop back on our planes for our vacation like very quickly.
Yeah.
It does show, doesn't it, how difficult it is to change human nature.
Yeah. And it wasn't ideal circumstances to change it, telling them to stay in their homes.
No.
Easier for some people than it was for others. And there was a lot about income inequality built into that experience of COVID that we're living in the shadow of COVID, I think, even though we've tried to forget it as much as possible.
Yeah.
Although it did give us a kind of an insight. It gave us a little bit of an insight into a post-growth world. It didn't solve the economic problem. Actually, to some extent, the cost of living crisis that came out of it rose off the back of that economic problem. we had to solve.
Yeah.
And it didn't solve the social problem. And it didn't really fix the limits either, because the emission reduction, as you say, was quite small and quite temporary. And we've kind of bounced back quite hard.
Right.
So we're not going to solve it through a pandemic. I think that's the lesson of COVID.
In terms of like working with the system, what about the idea of green growth? The idea that economic growth can be environmentally sustainable.
Well, first of all, let me say that I am totally in agreement with the idea of working with the system and in the system. And I know many very good people who work at the heart of the beast, so to speak, if we can call it a beast. And they are trying to change that system from within, and they recognize the limitations of the system. And I think there's a sort of distinction for me between those people who recognize the limitations of that system, who really recognize the limitations of that system and are trying to change it from within, and a set of people who want to have their cake and eat it, to use another eating metaphor, who want to have growth because that's the mantra, that's what's politically acceptable, that's the basis of our economic model, that's what we know. But obviously we don't want bad growth, so let's have good growth, and let's call it green growth because green is good. So you get this sort of tendency to say, I want to keep this language of growth, but I'm going to attach something to it which says I'm going to do something different. So it's a better kind of growth, a more sustainable growth.
Yeah.
And a smarter growth we've also had. Smart growth, green growth, sustainable growth. And what they are to me is they are aspirational tags. They are things that we do not know how to do.
Okay.
And we have not delivered. And I think that's a really important thing to say. We have not seen green growth. We've never seen it. We've never seen sustainable growth. We've never even really seen much smart growth. We've seen a lot of growth, but none of it has yet solved the problem that we're trashing the planet.
High-profile people, including the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, have called out GDP's limits as a way of measuring a country's development. Like, could it be recalibrated to include, like how things are made, so to account for environmental degradation and things like unpaid labor in the home?
I think it is. In fact, just from personal history, that's where I started.
Okay.
I remember very clearly the day when I walked into it was a small meeting in London, and I think it was probably, I can't remember exactly when it was, a long time ago. Let's not say how long ago it was. And I walked into this room and someone gave a presentation of something called the Index of Sustainable Economic Welfare, and it showed the line of GDP going up and up and up.
Yeah.
Over time. This was a study that was done in the United States by an economist called Herman Daly. And then compared to that, a different index, an index that did take into account environmental damage, that did take into account social limits, that did take into account unpaid housework, that did take into account actually financial factors that the GDP doesn't really bother with, that have a lot to do with economic stability. And the shape of that graph was very, very different. It didn't grow and grow and grow. It had grown up to a certain point, up to about the mid-1970s. And then beyond that point, it had flattened off completely, suggesting that even though the economy had grown, our well-being had not grown. And we've been looking at the wrong indicators.
Globally, though, we are still very much wedded to the use of GDP.
There was a point in time, it was a very interesting point in time because it was quite counterintuitive in a way. David Cameron came into power in 2010 in the coalition government in the UK and brought with him actually the idea that what we should be measuring is well-being, and created a well-being account for the UK.
Yeah.
And it sort of slipped away below the radar, and that's partly because of all the other things that happen in politics and that go wrong in politics.
Yeah.
But it is also because, I think for various reasons. One of them is that the political mindset moves quite slowly sometimes. But another is that you kind of get a sense of the ability to bog things down through vested interests. And I think it's quite important to say this, that even though the GDP and measuring the GDP and this narrow economics around the GDP is dysfunctional from a planetary perspective, and it's dysfunctional from a social perspective, it is kind of benefiting the people who can play the game.
There is one country that has famously come up with an alternative measure of its development: the Himalayan kingdom of Bhutan. compiles a gross national happiness indicator based on Buddhist philosophy. And because on this show we like to give a real-world example of what we're talking about, I thought we should talk to Dasho Karma Ura. He's the person who compiles the index. Karma, how are you?
I'm very well on a bright sunny day.
So how do you go about calculating the happiness index?
It is based on national survey of about 11,000 households done every 4 years. And we use 135 variables of the 11,000 households to compute the gross national happiness index. As expected, it will include a lot of non-material things.
Okay. But you measure things like emotional well-being, right? How do you measure emotional well-being?
We measure the frequency, not the intensity, which is a bit difficult to do. So, for example, in our survey, there is a question asking, in the last 1 month, how many times have you felt angry? The implication being that if you are frequently too angry and for too long, the idea of joy and happiness is not there.
And what have the surveys been telling you? Is Bhutan happy? What is the data showing?
The data, which, as I said, aggregates in a very complicated way, 135 variables, show that it is improving slowly, but within the 135 pieces of information, majority are progressing, but there are few which are static or going backward, and that is why it is improving only slowly. But that is expected. The GDP and the related versions go up by leaps and bounds, but you will expect human emotions will not improve or progress so rapidly, or nor will the community relationship improve so rapidly.
You raised an interesting point that GDP is kind of always growing, or the idea is the goal is constant growth, but that's not the case with the happiness index, right? Like it's not about constant improvement every 4 years.
Yeah, if you allow this kind of material production and consumption alone to dominate your life, you will soon find it will drive out your free time. You will soon find it will displace your intrinsic relationship with money. And you will soon find that you are not sleeping well, you are not meeting your friends, you are not having a cultural life. All your life is gone on working for somebody to produce something which you may or may not need.
But Bhutan's young people have been leaving. Youth unemployment is high, and there has been an exodus of people to Australia. How does that fit in with the idea of Bhutan as the kingdom of happiness?
Youth unemployment is high only at high level of wages because they expect, Bhutanese ambition and aspiration is rather high. They expect double the wage rates that is given to laborers in India. Indians, we have a lot of deficit labor. So Bhutanese people expect much higher wage rates and would rather be idle than taking a monotonous job at that rate. So that is the reason. They would rather work for a few years in Australia or Canada, and that is the main reason why they are going there. So at certain wage rate, there is unfulfilled demand for workers in this country. But that is the right attitude, in my opinion. One should not work for a kind of work you don't want. You want a happy, fulfilling work which is short hours, well-paying, and perhaps not working all the life.
So Tim, is politically now a good time for the post-growth movement? Like we've just come out of a US election where talk of GDP growth rang hollow. Like I know Donald Trump is probably the very opposite of a poster child for degrowth or post-growth, but something did happen in that election. You know, the whole concept of GDP growth, you know, everyone's doing better, really did not resonate.
Well, that is I mean, I think that's been quite. It's true. That is true of the Trump election. That people began to sort of see through that logic. In fact, even back in I can't remember when it was exactly. It was around about the Brexit vote in the UK, I think, and an economist went to a meeting and began to try and persuade people not to vote for Brexit because it would affect the GDP. It would have a really bad effect on our GDP in the UK. And then somebody from the audience shouted, "That's your bloody GDP. It's not ours."
Yeah.
So there's that popular realization actually that the language of the GDP, the language of growth, is a political language, and it's a language of elites who are benefiting from that growth to some extent, but the beneficiaries are not everyone. So this is where it gets a little bit tricky, of course, because then you have someone like Trump who comes along and says, the answer is growth, 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 and in order to achieve that, we're going to drill, drill, drill. And yes, maybe you can pump prime a little more growth so that it can trickle down to those people who haven't benefited from it yet. But this is a process that's been going on for years, if not decades, and those people have not. Economics hasn't trickled down. The money hasn't trickled down to the poorest. It's trickled up to the richest. And the data show that very, very clearly.
A big thank you to Tim and Karma for their time and their thoughts. It was fascinating talking to them both. A big thank you to you too for listening. If you like what you hear, subscribe to the show. Sound design, music composition, and engineering on this episode was by Josh Summer. Our podcast team includes Tara Oakes, Kim Vanell, Gail Issa, Jonah Green, Christopher Woljasper, David Spencer, and Sharon Reich-Garson. Our executive producer is Leela de Kretzer. Remember, for all your daily news, check out our weekday show, Reuters World News. You can catch it on the Reuters app or wherever you listen to your podcasts.